Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Monday Morning Coaching Corner with myself, Karen Jones from Rose Compass, and Margaret Dennis from Evolve Coaching. So I am really happy to have you here again, Margaret, so that we can keep touching on some of these subjects, albeit briefly, just to give an overview or an insight to what people are experiencing right now. Now, I know 2 weeks ago when you and I got together and put out our podcast, we talked briefly about trauma and how multiples of us have experienced trauma in very different ways, and we don't always recognize how trauma hits us. And it's the little things that build up that can be traumatic as much as the big things that happen to us that can be traumatic. But that being said, it's also about grief. Now, grief can be one of those big traumatic things that happens to us when we lose somebody, or we can go through grieving process when it's something that seemingly next to a death or a tragic loss like that, people dismiss. So first of all, thank you for joining me again.
You're
And
very welcome.
jump right in.
Well, I think it's really important for people to understand that if you've experienced trauma, there is always grief attached to it. Always. You cannot experience trauma without experiencing grief, yet they are two very separate things to deal with. You need to heal the trauma before you can start working on healing any grief that comes along with it, because they are separate things. Um, And exactly what you said, traumas can be big, they can be small. And if they're little and you sort of shove them off to the side, like, oh, it's not that important, or other people tell you it's not that important, then you don't deal with it and you just bury it, right? And it becomes part of you. And it becomes part of you anyway, right? As you and I both know, when you experience something, it internalizes, it becomes part of your body. Your body remembers that event, your body remembers that emotion and what happened. And if you don't confront the things that have happened and the emotions that go along with it, they just sit in your body and they build up over time, one over there. So you don't have to have like major trauma throughout your life. You could have a bunch of little things in your life. And then all of a sudden you're in your 40s wondering why you're depressed or anxious or, sleeping all the time or can't make decisions. And all of a sudden, and it's your body's way of telling you, pay attention. There's something going on that you need to deal with.
Yeah.
So.
And that's like we mentioned last time you and I got together, that's exactly what happened to me. It was a lifetime of little things and big things that accumulated in me having stuff that eventually showed in my heart and various other places in my body. But it's when you have these events happen to you, like for me, I was somebody that I always, so let me back up a little bit. When I was a younger kid, I was always told I was the proverbial rubber ball. Oh, Karen always bounces back. So when you're programmed that way, when you're programmed to believe, oh, you can do this and you will always bounce back, when things happen to you, you don't allow them to process through your body. Or for me, I didn't allow them to process through my body because my internal program was Karen always bounces back. So instead of allowing my body to be able to process what I was experiencing, my thought and my energy process was in how am I going to bounce back and bouncing back as quickly as possible without me having to experience what I'd actually gone through and allowing myself to unpack that in a way that was healthy and beneficial. And it wasn't until multiples of years later when the lid came off that I had to unpack the whole trunk and not just little suitcases.
And that's often what happens, right? Is it builds up and all of a sudden there's something big that you're like, what? Why is this so big? Because you're right. The programming that we get from day one, right? It's the vibes and the energy that we pick up around us from our parents and our siblings. And then we get verbal and we start learning about all of that. And we can start being able to communicate. People communicate with us and they tell us stories and they treat you in a certain way. And you take those stories in, and because you're not in a position when you're really little and a child to really create your own reality, right? Your reality is created from your external world and you take that in. And it isn't until you get older where you start to learn that I actually have agency over who I am. I can decide for myself how I'm going to react, and not maybe not how I'm going to react, but choosing to respond rather than react to
Yeah.
situation and be able. I think there's a lot of people out there that don't even realize that they need to do these things, right? That
Well,
they
we're just
need to
processing
actually
it. Yeah.
to process emotion because we're not taught that. We're
No,
taught to don't show emotion, keep it, go deal with it on your own, but we're not going to tell you how to do that. And, and like you said, you're the rubber ball. Karen will always bounce back because it's scary for other people to deal with anything else, right?
exactly.
That's not theirs.
Yeah.
But we're not taught how to express emotion. We're not taught that if something tragic happens to us or traumatic, or even something little that it's we need to acknowledge and just allow ourselves to feel whatever's there, right? It doesn't matter what the feeling is. There's no judgment around the feeling. You feel how
Mhm.
you feel. And I think we get caught up in the, ooh, I shouldn't feel this way because it's not as bad as so and so down the street who had something happen to them, right? Or really, I didn't get the promotion that I wanted. And yeah, as a trauma, that's like really small comparatively on the scale, but it's still something that happened to you.
Yeah. And it's something
And
big
if you
that person.
don't mourn the loss of the promotion that you thought you were going to have, it doesn't have to be big and extravagant. It just needs to be an acknowledgement and a release of the feeling. Then it sits there and it
Hmm.
sits there and the other things. And yeah, you have to acknowledge the feelings. You've got to let them out. And you
And
need somebody, sometimes you need people to help you do that because you can't do
absolutely.
it for yourself.
No,
It's
which
really
is
hard
where
to do.
what we do becomes very powerful.
Hmm.
When you're looking at social normals and things that people say to try and comfort somebody or
Mm,
to um, alleviate their discomfort in what
hmm.
somebody else is experiencing. It may be, oh, there's somebody always worse off than you. Oh, and
Hmm.
especially if somebody's passed, oh, well, at least they're not suffering anymore.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
so when you've lost somebody that is significant to you and the person closest to you, which are your family members usually, or your closest friends, are saying, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. It sets the stage where perhaps you feel like you can't express the depth of your loss
Hmm.
because they're telling you, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. But the one who's suffering now is you because you're going through that grief and that loss.
Hmm.
Or if you
Hmm.
lose somebody in a tragic way, you
Yeah.
know, that that is significant also.
Hmm. It is. And to your point too, when people say, well, at least they're not suffering anymore, it's like, well, that doesn't diminish the fact that they're gone,
No,
right? And that this event happened.
yeah,
And it's true. People say things, and I think a lot of what they say is it's just a knee-jerk reaction, right? If somebody passes away, what's the first thing you say? Oh, you're so strong, you're so brave, and you're going through this. Let me tell you, the people who are going through it don't want to be brave and they don't want to be strong. They want to be looked after or at least supported. When I lost my son, I I didn't want to be brave and strong. I wanted to go sit in the corner and rock and cry until the world disappeared, right?
right.
But I couldn't. It wasn't an option at that time because I also had my daughter that was there and she needed my care. And but the people around me are like, "Oh, I don't know how you're going through this. You're so brave. I couldn't imagine." And it's like, "No, you can't. And no, you don't know what I'm going through. All I need you to be here and do with me right now is just sit here, be quiet, or just say, I'm really sorry." You
Yeah,
know, when you say, I know exactly how you feel, A, you don't. You can never know how anyone else feels because we all come at an experience, even though maybe we both lost spouses, we both lost children, we both come at it from a whole different history and experiences. Therefore, we take it in and we experience it very differently. And the same idea of being brave and being strong. When people say be brave and be strong, they're saying it for their own personal benefit, not
right,
for yours, because
right.
subconsciously, if their brain is saying, if I can tell you to be brave and strong, and then you can be brave and strong, then whew, I dodged a bullet. It's not going to happen to me.
Yeah.
Right. And it's your brain kicking into that survival mode that you're not actually in control of, right? Like the reptilian brain that's fight, flight, or, and so sometimes we just say things because it it calms our own
Mm.
vulnerability and our own fear that
Yeah.
that could happen to us.
And also the discomfort. I know for myself, many years ago when I lived in the UK, one of my closest friends, her mum went to a comedy night
Hmm.
and was laughing at a comedian and had a brain hemorrhage and died at the table. So it
Oh my
was it
goodness.
was shocking. It was shocking.
Hmm.
It was unexpected. It was one of those trauma grief events that took place.
Hmm.
And I remember sitting with my friend and we started talking about all the things that her mum did, you know,
Hmm.
and every time I saw her, it was like, tell me another story about your mum. Tell me another story about your mum. And it wasn't until probably 3 or 4 months later that she actually said to me, she said, you're the only one that's ever asked me about my mum. She said, everybody else comes in and they avoid the conversation. She said, they want to say something, they'll say, I'm sorry for your loss. But then you can feel that their energy. She said, you can feel it's almost as though they put a cage around themselves and they're terrified to say something. She said,
Hmm.
that just makes me feel more uncomfortable. That makes me
Hmm.
more alone. That makes me feel like they're pushing the memory of my mum to the
Hmm.
back burner because it's too uncomfortable for them to bring her name up.
Hmm. 100%. And that's exactly why they're doing it, because they
Yeah.
don't know what to do to support you, right? If you've gone through really big trauma and grief, and you're suffering, and it's public knowledge, or and you're having like a funeral or a memory or like celebration of life, or however you're acknowledging that, when people come together, they want to help and they want to share their concern, but they don't know how. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
they bring you casseroles, which is a really big thing that people do. I had a lot of casseroles. I ate really, really well for the next month or two afterwards. But I'm glad that people did, because quite honestly, when you're in that state, you don't think about eating and it's easier to just have something done. But the casseroles are kind of the almost like you can, it's a physical barrier between you and the other person, but it's a gift of I care. And in our society, coming together with food and celebration is a way that we connect, right? So sometimes that casserole is actual, I'm trying to connect with you, I don't really know how, and this is the only thing I know to do,
Mm-hmm.
to say I'm thinking about you, and I'm sorry, so here's a casserole.
Yeah.
you know but instead of saying I'm going to sit down with you. You're sitting on the couch and you can say, how are you feeling?
Yeah.
Ask them, how are you feeling? Don't assume that you know what they're feeling. Maybe they're really angry.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not sad at all. Maybe they're just really, really mad. Give them the opportunity to talk about it. And it's not about you. At that particular moment, it is not about you. It is about the person who's grieving
Yeah.
and their loss. And if you want, and if you've suffered it too, if say you were close, but you're supporting the person who's there, ask them and then sit and listen.
Mm-hmm.
Actually be there, and show up, and don't just call, because usually if someone's grieving, they're not going to answer the phone if they don't want to talk to anybody. But if you show
Exactly.
up at the house and say, hi, I'm here and I'm making you dinner, or hi, I'm here, I'm making sure you're changing out of your pajamas that you've been in for 2 weeks, that is a sign of caring and helping.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's so much more helpful than be brave, be strong, because
Yeah.
then you're saying be brave, be strong by yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some people don't want the help. They will say, thank you very much, I'm okay on my own. And that's their way of trying to protect themselves too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not barge right in, but at least offer
Yeah.
and be strong enough to sit there and allow them to tell you, or just to cry.
Yeah.
I had friends who would come and sit with me and just let me cry on their lap, right? And that's all we did. I would lie there and cry, and they would just put their hand on my shoulder and let me cry.
Yeah.
Best thing they could have done for me, because there was
Yeah.
nothing that they could have done to change what happened.
No.
But their presence and their support were what I really needed.
Yeah, to just have somebody hold space for you. But
Hmm.
this is part of why us doing this is very important, because
Hmm.
this isn't a daily conversation.
Yeah.
People don't want to talk about dying. They don't want to talk about funerals. They don't want to talk about moving on after somebody's died. They don't want to
Mm-mm.
talk about what do you do when somebody's died and how do you act.
Hmm.
So, being able to bring this to people's awareness and say, if you're there, just hold space. If somebody,
Hmm.
because I think the assumption too sometimes is that when somebody's passed away, you expect them to be a blubbering wreck and just crying. But like you say, sometimes people are angry.
Hmm.
They're angry that they got left with children. They got angry that this happened. They're angry because there is no insurance to pay off the mortgage, and now they're raising two, three, four, five children, and there's no way of being able to pay bills. So you just
Hmm.
have to hold space.
Hmm. Yes. That's the best thing you can do for people, really, is just hold space and allow them to grieve how they need to grieve.
Mm-hmm. And there are levels of grieving.
Hmm. There are. There are. And even at that initial, that anger could be what's helping them survive that moment,
Yeah.
right? Because anger is easier to feel than sadness at
Yes.
that time. Because sadness can be really scary. And a lot of people who grieve, anyone I've talked to, even myself, when you're suffering from that deep feeling of grief and sadness, the idea of it will take over me if I give into it, right? If I start to cry, I will never stop. I will live in this realm forever. And so you avoid it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't because your body will just release, right? There are times where you just start crying and you can't stop, and that is okay. That's the other thing I want people to really understand is it's okay to express your emotion. It's okay to cry and try not, and unfortunately our society makes it a really embarrassing thing if you happen to break down in the middle of the laundry mat
Yeah.
or the grocery store, right?
Yeah.
When you see someone sitting there crying and you see people physically avoiding that person.
Oh, yeah, they
Like,
do.
yeah, but if you're standing there laughing, people are leaning in going, "What's so funny?" But if you see someone crying, they're like, "Ooh, better stay away from them,"
Yeah.
right? Something major's
Because it
going
makes
on.
them
I don't
feel
want to get
uncomfortable.
100%. And so I'm not quite sure where I was going with that. I kind of went off on track, but the idea of just acknowledging the feelings that you have
Mhm.
and trying not to judge them, just allow them to come. They're coming up for a reason,
Yeah.
right? You're feeling the anger. Maybe the anger is masking the sadness, and then allowing that sadness to come as it will when you move forward, but you have to allow it. If you keep pushing it down, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you're going to have the explosion.
Yeah, exactly. And the other
And
thing that you and I wanted to talk about is the duration of time for grieving.
there
Now,
is no
there
duration
is
of
no
time for
duration.
grieving.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
people, oh, and I have a prime example for this. Um, Back in the UK, I had a friend whose husband had Alzheimer's, and
Mm,
he was deteriorating over a long period of time. It was a very, very slow process. And he ended up in a long-term care facility. And by the time she was going to the long-term care facility, he didn't even know who she was.
mm,
He completely lost connection with any of his family. He didn't know his two daughters and he didn't know his wife. And this went on for quite some time. And she did all of her grieving through that process.
mhm,
So as her husband disappeared more and more and more and more from her life, she went through all of the grieving stages while he was alive, while he was
mhm,
going through his Alzheimer's stage. Now, after he passed away, it was 3 months later, and she went to visit a friend of hers and met a guy.
mhm,
And he had been recently, within the last 18 months, been widowed. And they had this common connection.
mhm,
And 6 months later, they moved in together. But her daughters were furious,
mhm,
furious that she hadn't spent an appropriate amount of time grieving.
mhm.
And there is no appropriate time, because
There
she did
isn't.
her grieving. Her daughters did their grieving after their dad left.
Hmm.
she did her grieving over a long period of time, so that when he
Yes.
finally left, she was ready to start living a life again.
Hmm.
And her daughters could not wrap their head around the fact that a very short period of time that they considered inappropriate, that she was
Hmm.
ready to move on and get remarried.
Yeah. And that is very common where people will put their own beliefs and expectations and ideas about what grief should look like on
Mm-hmm.
you. And they'll say, no, 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 I'm sorry, you're still not wearing black. Oh, you're starting to date. You're starting to actually smile and laugh. That hasn't fit into my particular time period of what I expect or what I think grieving should be all about. And it's too bad because what often happens is the people who are trying to move on, like your friend who did a lot of grieving and was ready to move on,
Yeah.
she lost her husband far before he actually physically left. He
Mm-hmm.
was gone a long time before. And that's, I do, I do a seminar around caregiver grief and guilt as well. And it's when you're going through all of that, you grieve through the process, right?
Yeah.
You're grieving every time something changes and you're losing another piece of them. And so you're right, by the time he physically leaves or person physically leaves, you have done so much grieving that it's almost like a relief.
Exactly. And that's how she felt.
And God forbid you say, "Oh, so relieved," because then you are an evil, bad person,
Yeah.
right? It doesn't matter that you've spent the last 10 years nursing and caring for somebody who is declining and mentally leaving this world, but then it's not okay for you to feel like you can get your life back,
I know.
right? That
Yeah.
you can live again. And it's so unfortunate because people get caught up in what other people think and they get caught up in the guilt of moving on.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I stay with in the memory and I honor this person, there's nothing wrong with that,
Mm-hmm.
but it keeps you stuck and you're still here.
Yeah. It's
You
that
get to
process.
live your life. You get to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
You get to find joy again because you're still here. You can't change what happened. You can grieve and maybe it'll take you a few years before you're ready. Maybe it'll take you 3 months.
Yeah.
You don't know.
No, you don't know. And we get so caught up on what society thinks and what society's quote unquote normal time is,
Hmm.
that we end up holding ourselves back from a life to be lived,
Hmm.
and you still take those memories, and you can't take away anything from the life
No.
that you shared with the person that you were with.
Hmm.
And I have, since I moved to Canada, it was probably 2 or 3 years after I moved here. It was through my ex-husband. He had a friend and his wife passed away. And back then we had the answer machines, the phone and the answer machine in it. We
Hmm.
don't use those anymore. But she'd had a recording. She recorded the incoming message on the answer machine, and he couldn't clear that. He'd call the house every day just to hear her voice that was
Yeah.
on that answer machine. And that's putting yourself back into that cycle of pain and loss all of the time.
Hmm.
But it's what he felt he needed to do to help him process that pain and
Hmm.
loss.
Well, it's interesting you say that because my aunt has done the same thing, and my uncle passed away just before my daughter was born, about 14 years ago. And it's always kind of weird to phone their home line, and my uncle would, it's his voice, but at the same time, it's comforting because you're
Right.
like, oh, I heard his voice again. That's really beautiful. And I think that's what it is for her too, is that she's moved on. She's creating a very happy life for herself. But it's still that if I want to hear his voice just one more time, it's
Mm-hmm.
there. And and that's what she's comfortable with. And I think that, if it doesn't hold her back, then it for her, she finds it comforting and just it's just a memory for her. And
Mm-hmm.
it's different. People react so differently. But yeah, to we everybody grieves in their own way, right?
I
That's
know.
that's
I
the big
know.
thing is you could be doing the same thing for different reasons. You could be expressing yourself the same way, but still the underlying feeling is different. You could
Mm-hmm.
be grieving the way you need to grieve, that is completely different to how your sister needs to grieve or your brother needs to grieve. You may both lose a parent and there'll be 5 kids and every single one of you will grieve differently.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
none of them is right or wrong. It just is.
Yeah. And I mean, you can lose somebody significant in your life and go through um, an extremely uncomfortable, painful grieving process so that you have that in your memory banks, in your cellular being, and you're afraid that you're going to feel like that the next time somebody passes, but the
Mm-hmm.
next time it can be completely different. You probably,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a different person, a different relationship, a different depth. So like you
Mm-hmm.
say, every single process of grief is very, very different.
It is. It really is. And I think in our society, we don't give people the space to grieve the way they need to. And we put so much judgment around it,
Yeah.
but we put judgment around things that we haven't taught or learned about, right? It's just this is how it should be. Well, who says?
Yeah.
Who said it has to be this way? Who says that this is, and I understand on some religions, there's certain things that happen and they follow a process and they follow um, the steps that they've been told, or that's how they honor. And that's great, right? And then there's a whole lot of us out there who don't have those to fall back on, and we still get to grieve. We all have to grieve. And even if you are following a doctrine to grieve, doesn't mean that that's how you want to grieve,
No, exactly.
right? You need to listen to yourself and do what's best for you. And grief is a journey. It never, like, if you've experienced a traumatic or grief event, it will always live with you. You will
Mhm.
always have that experience. The intensity may fade over time and you will move forward. You don't have, like, you will keep going. And you may get to a point where you're like, I'm happy. This is
Yeah.
good. I'm living a life of joy. And then something will trigger that memory of that person and you may cry again. That's okay too.
Oh,
I
yeah.
my son died over 14 years ago and every time I look at my daughter, not every time, but why sometimes I sit back and look at my daughter and go, what if her brother had survived,
Yeah.
right? What would their life be like? Would they be getting along? Would they be fighting? They were twins. So, what would it be like with having him here? And sometimes I kind of, I go, oh, it'd be pretty cool. And I can look at it objectively and be warm. Other times I just cry,
Yeah.
but I don't get lost in it, right? It
No.
doesn't overcome me. It's not become something that then my day's shot. It's like the moment, but I let it come.
Hmm.
I'm like, okay, I'm just going to feel this for a minute. I'm sad. Okay, now I'm going to keep going. Because if I went, no, no, can't think about it. It's too much, then it just stays there. But you
And
have
it gets
to
bigger.
allow your,
Yeah.
and it does get bigger. It does get bigger.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And we've talked about grief of losing some person in your life, but
Hmm.
there's multiple different
Oh,
types of grief, like you mentioned
oh,
earlier
yeah.
with trauma. There's grieving of losing a job, grieving of having to leave a job when you didn't want to leave a job. There
Hmm.
is grieving of moving from one country to another and leaving people behind.
Hmm.
So there's multiple levels of grief that we go through that we don't always recognize as grief.
Oh, yes. There is grief all throughout our lives. And there's grief around the happy times too. You're
Yeah.
getting married. You're going to get married, and that's an exciting time. But give yourself a chance to recognize that there's also a little bit of a sadness and a grief around leaving the life behind that you're leaving behind and moving into a new chapter. It's exciting, but there's that grief of leaving that behind. Same thing when you have a baby. You
Hmm.
go from being a very individual being to now being 100% responsible for another life. You are no longer alone,
Yeah.
right? You become responsible when your children leave home. You know, there's all kinds of things that can be looked at and celebrated. And we celebrate weddings and births and all of that. But there's also a grief component to that.
Hmm.
I developed a grief scale. I have 30 different um, life events that could happen. Some of them are death related, a lot of them are not. And I give those to my clients and I give them out in my workshops. And I say, check off all of the ones that have happened to you. And people are astounded.
Yes.
Like on average of the 30, on average, from what I've done, it ranges from 14 to 15. I actually had one person in my workshop score 29
Right.
out of 30, and they all just sit there and look at and go, holy smokes, I had no idea that there was grief related to this. And so that's all unprocessed grief that is
Yeah.
still living in their body that they haven't dealt with, because
Yeah.
it's all around loss and change. And loss and change can include a death, but like you said, it could be an abuse. It could be I got bullied in school. It could be I failed an exam. I didn't get into the school that I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I flunked out of university. It could be all of those things,
Yeah.
because it's a loss, a change, a disappointment that's happened. And by not being able to recognize where grief it could be coming up, it makes it difficult to deal with, because
Yeah.
you don't know to deal with it in those cases, right? You're
No.
like, oh, I'm feeling something, but I don't know if that's grief. I just feel mad or upset or disappointed, but there's also grief.
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Like you say, when it shows up in your body, it shows up somewhere because we've stuffed it down for so long that
Mm-hmm.
it starts showing up somewhere that you have to deal with it and start unpacking it. And very
Mm-hmm.
often the end result is you're unpacking that grief and that sadness and that loss and that pain and
Mm-hmm.
and and even an expectation. You know,
Mm-hmm.
um if you got married and you had an expectation that you were both going to be together, divorce is a grief.
Mm-hmm.
You have this fairy tale wedding and you're together 5 years and all of a sudden you're not together anymore. There's a grieving process
Mm-hmm.
in amongst all of that, of the fairy
Mm-hmm.
tale not being the fairy tale, or the dream that you had as a 3 year old walking down the aisle, and all of that is a grieving process that we don't even recognize sometimes, that
Mm-hmm.
is part of our emotional body that we carry, that
Mm-hmm.
is operating all of the time.
Mm-hmm. It is. And you're right, it starts to show up in our body too. And sometimes it's very blatant, like a lower backache, or I get migraines all the time, or I've got like a lot of tension through my shoulders. And it's not just from sitting at a laptop all day,
Yeah.
or I'm starting to get hives, or I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm stressed. I can't make decisions. It starts showing up. The more you have, the more your body is going to try and express it in a way that is like, hello,
Yeah.
pay attention, please. And if you're not aware that you've even experienced grieving and traumatic events, you don't even know that you need to unpack them. But if your body's screaming out to you, like, you really need to pay attention to the hives on your arms, or the fact that you're, you know, getting these spots, or you're whatever, and they're unknown, start having a look and seeing what else has been in there. That it's not may not be your environment, it's your internal
Yeah.
environment,
It's your
your
internal
internal
environment.
emotion.
Yeah. 100.
And start looking at that as a possibility of what's going on for you.
Yeah.
Where have you not acknowledged things and expressed things?
Mm-hmm. Now, some of
Mm-hmm.
the tools that we can use to help process that, besides either seeing a coach like yourself or myself, is
Mm-hmm.
journaling.
Mm-hmm.
Write down your emotions. Now, one of the things that I found very powerful with people that I've done journaling with is to actually write it as though you're writing a letter to yourself. Dear Karen, and then
Mm-hmm.
start, this is what I'm feeling. So you start unpacking it that way and start writing in a journal and allowing it just to flow without
Mm-hmm.
judgment is the biggest key. Just allow
Mm-hmm.
it to just flow and unravel and unwind and unpack page after page after page after page until you
Mm-hmm.
stop writing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do you have any other tools besides journaling that someone could use to help process the grief that they may be experiencing?
I do a process in my coaching sessions where I take them down deep into the emotions to unpack them that way. I use journaling as well. And the other thing I like to do with my clients with the journaling is, if it's something that they really want to just get rid of, write it and burn it. Because
Right.
if you write it, you don't want to sit down and read it all back to yourself, because all you're doing is taking it back in. Um, the other things I do with my clients too is really have them start to focus on self-care. And it's things that and you don't have to see a coach for that either, right? What can you do that's going to help you feel better?
Mm-hmm.
What are some things that you can do that it's like, you know what, I love bubble bath, or I really love to go for a walk in nature. Meditating helps a lot too, right? When you're like, oh my God, stuff's going on. I don't understand what's going on. Sometimes just sit and be still and listen to what comes up for you. Maybe all of a sudden there's that event comes front and center. Your body's like, hello, here it is again. You need to pay attention to this memory. Little things like that that you can start even giving yourself an opportunity to be open to hearing and listening to your body and listening to what's happening inside of you
Mm-hmm.
to bring you that awareness. The journaling brings amazing awareness, right? You just start, especially when you're free writing, it's just like, wow,
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're writing and you can't stop. And the same thing happens if you're still and you sit in some meditation. Just
Mm-hmm.
quiet. It could be silent, it could be a little bit of music, whatever it is, to just be still and listen to yourself. Feel what you feel. Where's the pain?
Mm-hmm.
What's under that pain, right? Like put your hand on your body wherever that is and just sit with it
Yeah. Yeah.
and really give yourself the time to connect to yourself. That's really the key, is really you need to connect to yourself. Shut out the noise and pay attention to yourself.
Mm-hmm. I know with some of the custom created meditations that I do, if I'm doing anything like that with anybody, I'll even ask them to color associate emotions. So when I'm
Mm-hmm.
custom creating a meditation, once they color associate the emotions, you can actually work to be able to pull that out, and to do that alongside journaling can be very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm. I actually have an emotion wheel that I can give
Yes.
people.
Yeah, I have
And yeah,
one.
I'm sure you have it too, right? With the colors, but it has so many words describing emotions. So if you're having trouble expressing your emotion and you're like, I feel something, read through it and it'll be like, oh, it's that. That's what I feel. Because sometimes we don't know the words to identify our emotions. I'm like, I feel this. I think it's kind of this. But when you can really, truly like narrow in on what is that emotion,
Mm-hmm.
it's so helpful.
100%, because we use the most common emotions. I'm
Hmm.
frustrated, I'm angry, you know, I'm sad, I'm happy. We
Hmm.
don't use, I don't know anybody that I've ever met that says, oh, I'm feeling full of joy today,
Hmm.
or I'm feeling irritated, or there's so many layers underneath, just underneath anger. There's so many layers
Hmm.
underneath anger.
Hmm.
So, like you say, being able to identify those actual words and emotions that we're feeling that we don't commonly connect to can be very
Hmm.
powerful in helping to release the emotion and the pain of grief.
Hmm. Hmm. And it's really important to be able to identify what those are. Because if you can't really truly identify what the emotion is, you can't release it. You can't
No.
work through it. And sometimes you have to peel through those later layers of I'm frustrated, I'm angry. Okay, you're frustrated. Why are you frustrated? Okay, and then you're angry. Why are you angry? And let's sit. Okay, so you were frustrated and angry. Okay, now what are you? Like, what if it's not gone yet? What else is still sitting there? What else is
Yeah.
sitting there? And a lot of times I'll encourage people to ask themselves, what are you feeling? Or what else? Over 7 times. Because there's
Yeah.
that 7 layer deep, right?
Yeah.
I did that in a workshop today with a group of ladies, and I was talking about, figuring out what it is that they really wanted, right? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? And it was incredible where they went with that. It was like, ooh, I want to be successful. But when it finally came down to it, it's like, I want freedom.
Right.
One woman said, I want my business to take care of itself. And when she got down to it, it was like, I want a baby. And it
Right.
was like so completely different. But you need to go layer deep, right? What do you want? Okay, now what do you want? And
Mm-hmm.
then what does that bring you? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? And you have to do that with your emotions too, right? It's
A
like, I
hundred
feel
percent.
angry. Okay, you feel angry. What else? And what else?
What
And what
else?
else?
What else? What else? Yeah.
And really dig down, because you can deal with the surface, but you really have to get down to the core.
Yeah, I know I've gone through all those layers with clients too, and gone from angry to through those 7 layers and going down, 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 down to the final one is I don't feel like I'm heard.
Hmm.
So until you identify, I don't feel like I'm heard, and all you
Hmm.
say is I'm angry, then
Yeah.
the process is very, very different.
100%. Dealing with I don't feel heard is very different from dealing with I'm angry.
100% it is.
Yeah.
100%.
Hmm.
Now, before we close, because you and I, one of the things that I want to tell people is on Wednesday, you and I are going live, right?
We are going live to do a
Yeah.
Q&A. Very
Yes.
exciting.
Yeah. So at noon on
Hmm.
Wednesday, Margaret and I will be going live on Rebels Compass, and we would love for you to join us. We are wanting to go live to be able to do a Q&A, to whether it be about trauma, whether it be about grief, whether it be about something else that you're experiencing, and perhaps we can help shine some light on that and help you through that process of discovery. Because when
Hmm.
you're in discovery, it's an amazing process to keep unpacking things so that in the process of discovery, you find you. And it's just such a very, very powerful place to be. So we're going live on Wednesday at noon, and we are very excited to do that because it's the first time
Hmm.
Margaret and I have done that. I'm very
Hmm.
excited for you to join us. So is there anything you want to share, Margaret, before we head out?
I think the only thing is just honor your emotions and allow them to be there. Don't put judgment on them. Just, you can feel your emotions. What you do with them, how you act out on them is one thing, but allow yourself to feel them and allow them to come out and so that you don't stay stuck in grief and the sadness. That would be my big
100%.
thing. And I'm very excited about the Q&A on Wednesday too.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I want to
Yeah.
thank you for joining me again, Margaret. We've
Thank
got
you.
lots of things that we're unfolding and hoping to share with everybody. But please share this video. You never know who needs to hear what we talked about today and how it might support them and help them move forward. Or maybe they want to reach out to Margaret or I and be able to get some support in a different area. But please join us on Wednesday. We would love to have you, and noon on Rebels Compass this Wednesday for a live Q&A. So again, Margaret, thank you so much for joining me. And thank
Thank
you
you so much.
to everybody for listening to these videos, for sharing them, for being that platform that we can have these conversations and bring more normalcy to something that very often isn't talked about and people feel isolated and alone. So share, 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 and we will see you on Wednesday. Thank you so much, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye.